What is the greatest threat to the freedom and well-being of the American people? Join me in this week's Libertarian Angle as I address that question. I am Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism, especially in the context of the burning issues of the day. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 32 years of principled, uncompromising perspectives on liberty. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have strived for, more than 20 years now to make the best libertarian daily commentary page on the internet. And, of course, subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, to this YouTube channel, and, of course, we would greatly appreciate your voluntary support in the form of donations that you can make at fff.org. So I want to talk to you today about what I have long considered to be the biggest threat to our well-being, to our liberties, to our rights, and that is the national security state, the form of governmental structure that we've had in this country since around the time of the end of World War II. This governmental structure is a totalitarian type of governmental structure. To put things in perspective, North Korea is a national security state, so is China, so is Russia, so are many other countries, Pakistan, Burma. These are types of governmental structures in which the government wields omnipotent dark side powers. Now, in some of the national security states, it's clear that the national security establishment is in full control of the government. They're the ones in charge of running things. What's a little bit different with respect to the American national security state is that we still retain the traditional three branches of government that we all learned about as kids in the civics classes in high school. There's the executive branch, it's represented by the president. There's the legislative branch represented by Congress, and then there's the judicial branch. And they all have their little separate powers as enumerated in the Constitution. But what's different about the national security branch of the government is there are no limits on its powers. And so when you've got a section of the government that has essentially omnipotent powers, that is omnipotent government, for all practical purposes, that is a government that wields omnipotent powers. All you need is one section of the government doing that. And what inevitably happens, and what has happened in the United States, is the other three branches inevitably start deferring to the most powerful branch, the branch that's exercising the omnipotent powers. Many of you know that I've long recommended a book, or at least for several years have recommended a book, by Michael Glennon called National Security and Double Government. Glennon is a professor of law at Tufts University. He's also served as counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You can Google his name. You'll see that the man has impeccable legal credentials. And this book says, and it's a very readable book. I mean, it's scholarly, but it's very accessible and very readable, and I've been recommending it for years. His thesis is very simple, that it's really the national security branch of the government that is running the show, running the federal government. And this has particular consequences with respect to what's going on in Ukraine. Because if Glennon's right, and I believe he is right, Biden's not making the calls on this. Biden's just acting in support. He's playing out his role. That it's really the Pentagon and the CIA that are out there making the decisions on admitting Ukraine into NATO, which would entitle the Pentagon and the CIA to put their nuclear missiles in that country, pointing at Russia. They're the ones making the call on how much armaments and weaponry are being provided to Ukraine. They're the ones making the foreign policy decisions as to what's going on here, the goals to weaken Russia. They're the ones making the decisions on providing intelligence to the Ukrainian forces to assassinate all those Russian generals or to sink that Russian ship. So, as I've said in some of my articles, I think we're closer here with this what I consider a very reckless foreign policy. We're closer to the possibility of nuclear war, if through nothing else, just a mishap, than we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what I want to talk about with you today is why it's necessary, if we're going to achieve a free society, why it's necessary to get rid of this national security state. A national security state is antithetical to the principles of freedom. And that requires us to go back to some of the good founding principles of America. We know there were some bad founding principles like slavery and violation of women's rights, but there are also some good founding principles. And one of those good founding principles was that our government got established as a limited government republic. Now, what does that mean? It means that the government is divided into three branches, and there's only three branches because there was no national security branch of the government. That all you had was three branches, and under the executive branch, you had a relatively small basic military force. The framers and our American ancestors did not want a national security state. A national security state inevitably involves a massive permanent standing military establishment, a very powerful military establishment, one that's ever growing, ever voracious, wants more power, more money, and in which it embroils the nation in all kinds of crises and chaos, especially in foreign affairs. There's always an intelligence component where there's massive secret surveillance. Our ancestors, that was the last thing they wanted. Their term for a national security state at the time was standing armies. In other words, big, permanent, standing military intelligence establishments. They wanted no part of it. You can Google on our website at fff.org standing armies, and you can see that I've put together a list of quotes there from prominent founding fathers expressing their deep antipathy toward standing armies, toward national security states, military-industrial complexes, and so forth. Now, why did they do that? Well, they explain in these quotes that the biggest threat to their freedom lies with their very own government. And you see, that truth has been lost on Americans. Americans have been indoctrinated. I mean, I don't think there's a better word, with the notion that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA protect them. They protect national security. That if it weren't for them, the United States would be run by the Muslims or the communists or whoever. Whatever the threat of the day is. That without the national security establishment, we'd be conquered by some foreign regime or some foreign group or whatever. So they always need official enemies. Well, so the notion always is that there's big threats out there that need to be put down, or Americans need to be protected from these threats, and that's the whole idea of the national security state. Well, our ancestors said, well, this is just nonsense. That there's no threat out there greater than the threat of a massive standing military intelligence establishment. That's where you lose your rights and your liberties. And that's exactly what's happened. So you go through the entire 19th century with this just basic military force. It doesn't have the ability to establish foreign military bases, to embroil the nation in foreign wars, at least wars in Europe and Asia. They waged a war against Mexico, a fairly limited war in scope. Of course, there was the Civil War. But the idea always was that America would be a government of limited powers, a limited government republic. And we even pay lip service to that notion. If you look at conservatives, for example, they have that favorite mantra of theirs that says, we favor free enterprise, private property, and limited government. Okay, but they don't really. I mean, the truth is that conservatives are big supporters of the national security establishment, the national security state form of governmental structure. So now what happens is that after World War II, the argument is made that, well, okay, Americans have just fought this huge war against the Nazi government, and it supposedly poses great threat to taking over the world, even though it it couldn't even cross the English Channel and conquer England. But that was the argument. And so Americans can't rest, though, is what they said, because now they're facing arguably a bigger foe than the Nazi regime. And that foe was communism and the Soviet Union, which was, of course, whose principal member, of course, was Russia. So here we get the deep anti-Russia animus. Now, it wasn't the first time that this animus existed, and you can go all the way back to the 1920s and 1930s, where there was a deep anti-Russia animus. This was the roots of the anti-communist crusade. I mean, the argument was the communists are coming to get us. The Reds are almost here. And that becomes very prominent after World War II. Now, ironically, the Soviet Union had been America's World War II partner and ally. They'd worked together to defeat the Nazi regime. But as soon as the war was over, Russia, the Soviet Union, the communist world gets converted into this big official enemy, which is then used as the justification for converting the United States to a national security state. Now, there was nothing formal. There was certainly no constitutional amendment, which had to be required when you have a major transformation in a governmental structure. It certainly would require a constitutional amendment. The nation gets established as a limited government republic, 3 branches with limited powers, and all of a sudden now you've got a new governmental structure with omnipotent dark side powers. Okay, now what do I mean by dark side powers? The power of assassination, to carry out state-sponsored assassinations. Now, they were done secret, but that doesn't matter. As long as the government wields the power to assassinate people, that's an omnipotent power. How much more power could you have than the power to just go out and kill somebody without due process? Now, as a limited government republic, the 3 branches could not do that. You've got the 5th Amendment that says no person shall be deprived of life without due process of law. Due process means a formal charge, an indictment, a trial. And then at that point, you decide whether, is this a death penalty offense or not? With the advent of the national security state form of governmental structure, that 5th Amendment goes out the window. Okay? Now, it still applies to the 3 branches, but it doesn't apply to the 4th branch. And I consider it the 4th branch because it is the most powerful section of the government, the power to snuff out a person's life. Okay? Now, they have to relate it to national security, but they're the ones that decide national security. The Supreme Court immediately started deferring to them and said, we're not going to get involved in second-guessing these kind of things, that we don't have the expertise for this. And so you have this deference to the authority of the national security state. Indefinite detention, kidnapping people. I mean, holding somebody in jail for the rest of their lives without a trial. I mean, we've seen that with what's going on with Guantanamo. I mean, this is what was going on in communist countries, indefinite detention, torture. I mean, when I was a kid, the idea that America would ever be torturing people is like inconceivable. And yet, the national security state has that authority, including on Americans. I mean, that's what the Jose Padilla case was all about, to establish that this authority to torture people extends to American citizens as well, and as well as the power of assassination. So these are dark side powers that came into existence with the adoption of the national security state form of governmental structure. So you get the Pentagon, you get the vast, permanent, ever-growing military intelligence establishment, foreign military bases. Then you combine this with foreign interventionism, coups, regime change operations, invasions, wars of aggression, undeclared wars. You get the CIA involved in all this, and they've got their assassination manual almost immediately. They start working on that, studying assassination, how to carry it out without people figuring out that the CIA was part of it. Then you've got the NSA with massive secret surveillance of the citizenry, all designed, you see, to keep people safe. Well, in the process, you lose your liberties. I mean, there's that old saying of, trading liberty for security. Well, that's exactly what happened with the adoption of the national security state way of life. Now, we've all been indoctrinated into believing that we're a free people. Thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free. But the fact that people falsely believe they are free doesn't make them free. My favorite quote, as longtime supporters of FFF know, is by Goethe. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And that's the plight of the American people. That quote captures perfectly the plight of the American people. Americans truly believe they are a free people, despite the fact that they live under a government of omnipotent powers. So when the conversion took place to a national security state, that was the end of freedom, because you cannot conceivably be considered free when you're living under a regime that has the power of assassination, of embroiling the nation in foreign wars. Remember what Madison said, that of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest, because war is when the government gains the authority, or at least takes the authority, to destroy rights and liberties of the citizenry in the name of fighting the war. And so with the advent of the national security state, we've been involved essentially permanently in war ever since. And you got the Cold War, you got the Korean War, you got the Vietnam War, then you've got all the interventions, the coups, all designed to keep us safe from the communists. When the Cold War supposedly ends, you end up with a military and a regime that's going abroad in the Middle East, killing people over there, Persian Gulf War, the sanctions and embargo against Iraq that was killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. Then you get the terrorist blowback, the attack on the USS Cole, the attacks on the embassies in East Africa, the 9/11 attacks. Then you got the whole full-blown war on terrorism that replaces essentially the war on communism to a certain extent. But behind the scenes, it turns out that the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA never, ever ended the Cold War. They were that anti-Russia animus that drove the Cold War from the end of World War II was passed on clearly from one generation to the next generation of generals and CIA officials. So when NATO, when the Cold War ostensibly ended, NATO should have gone out of business. I mean, NATO's mission was to protect, supposedly, Western Europe from a Soviet attack, which was always ridiculous. I mean, the Soviet Union at the end of World War II was decimated. I mean, the Nazis had come within an inch of conquering the whole country. They destroyed the whole country, killing millions of people. The thought that the Soviet Union was going to attack Western Europe, which inevitably would have embroiled the United States, the nation with nuclear weapons and willingness to use nuclear weapons against populated cities, is ludicrous. But that was the idea of NATO. Oh, well, just in case the Russians decide that they're going to conquer the world, we're going to have NATO. All right, but when the Cold War ends, what happens with NATO? It stays in existence. And even worse, they start using NATO to absorb Eastern European countries, former Warsaw Pact countries, which means that the U.S., the Pentagon, and the CIA are getting their forces and their nuclear weapons closer and closer to Russia. So instead of just leaving Russia alone at the end of the Cold War, they instead start moving troops, moving weaponry, moving nuclear missiles closer and closer to Russia's borders. And Russia made it clear the whole time, for the last 20 years, look, you're not going to put your nuclear missiles on our border here in Ukraine. And we're not going to allow that. Even though, as people have argued, Ukraine's got the right to do that. But the Pentagon and the CIA knew that Russia's position was the same as the U.S. position. And I'm, of course, referring to Cuba. When the Soviets put missiles there to protect Cuba from an attack by the Pentagon and the CIA and the CIA's position and President Kennedy's position was, no, you're not going to do that. Yeah, you may be a sovereign and independent country here, Cuba and the Soviet Union, but we're just not going to permit you to have these nuclear missiles pointing at America from 90 miles away. Now, so Cuba and the Soviet Union clearly had the legal authority to do this. They're sovereign, independent countries. But as a practical matter, U.S. officials said, you're not going to do it. And the Pentagon and the CIA were pressuring Kennedy throughout the crisis to just attack, bomb, invade Cuba, just like what Russia has done with Ukraine. And so Russia had made it clear that if you insist on joining NATO, which would give the U.S. the right to have its nuclear missiles in Ukraine, we're going to invade. And despite that warning, the Pentagon and the CIA's position was tough luck. We're going to call your bluff. We're going to keep moving eastward. We're going to invite Ukraine into NATO. That would entitle us to put our nuclear missiles there and get used to it. Well, Russia said, no, we're not going to get used to it. Now, they could have just chosen to just say, hey, okay, go ahead and put your nuclear missiles here. Just like the U.S. could say, if North Korea started to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, they could say, okay, go ahead and do it. But we all know that the U.S. would never permit that to happen, and Putin made it very clear that he wasn't going to allow that to happen. So they essentially put Putin in the position of, you either let Ukraine into NATO, which lets our nuclear missiles be put there, or you invade. That's your choice. And Putin chooses to invade. And so now the U.S. is flooding weaponry in there, helping the Ukrainians assassinate Russian generals as part of this conflict. I mean, it has all the appearance that this is now a war between NATO and the United States, NATO and Russia. The U.S. helped Russia get the intelligence to sink the flagship of the Russian fleet. I mean, this is pretty direct military support here, and it's highly reckless, highly dangerous, because they're essentially putting Russia in the position of now making a decision. They've stymied the Russian advance, which now frees up Ukraine to join NATO, and so Russia's put into an interesting position. Do they simply accede to this, which is what they said they would never accede to, or do they use tactical nuclear weapons as a way to undo this massive military reinforcement that has been provided Ukraine? And I mean, we can all hope that, given that choice, that Russia says, okay, we give up. Go ahead and put your nuclear missiles, join NATO, and so forth. As compared to, you're not going to do this, and if our only recourse to win this thing is with tactical nukes, we're going to do that. We can only hope that doesn't happen, because if it were to happen, we don't know what the result would be. We don't know what the U.S. response would be at that point. But my hunch is that there'd be a lot of Americans fleeing American cities. So as y'all know, I have a new book out called An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story, where I delve into this whole idea of a national security state. Now, the common question I get is, what relevance does the Kennedy administration and the Kennedy assassination have to current events? And I keep telling people it has all the relevance in the world. I mean, by studying this administration and studying this assassination, you can get a better, deeper understanding of why we're mired in these foreign policy crises, chaos. This is no way to live. I mean, if you like this way of life with perpetual war, perpetual conflicts, perpetual chaos, crises, death, destruction, now the highly dangerous, reckless foreign policy, fine, just keep supporting this way of life. I mean, most Americans do. Jacob, we need a national security establishment to keep us safe. National security is everything, Okay, fine. But you will live your life in perpetual chaos, and you will live your life without freedom. In order to achieve freedom and a fairly normal life, a life that doesn't have all these constant wars and crises and chaos, a necessary prerequisite is to restore a limited government republic. Now, one of the reasons why the Kennedy years is so critical, as short as that term was that Kennedy upset the apple cart. Kennedy questioned the whole very notion of the Cold War. It's almost as if he saw this as just a total racket, which it is, but we haven't really come to terms with that. Was the Cold War a racket or not? Was it necessary or not? Was it used as a fraudulent justification for the conversion of the federal government to a national security state. Was all this anti-Russia animus necessary? Because Kennedy goes to American University and says, I'm moving America in a new direction here. He threw the gauntlet down at the national security establishment. No president has ever done that. Trump hinted at it, but it ended up, right before he comes into power, he goes to the CIA and kneels and kisses the CIA ring. He surrounds himself with generals and warmongers. Kennedy didn't do any of that. Kennedy stuck by his position when he said, we're gonna move America in a new direction. We're not going to have an anti-Russia animus. This country's not going to be driven by this anti-Russia animus. Now, it was the anti-Soviet Union at that time, but everybody knew that Russia was the principal member of the Soviet Union. And Kennedy said, enough. Not going to happen anymore. So here he has a conflict of visions, a fundamental conflict of visions. He is moving America in a direction that is different from the direction that the national security establishment believes is necessary to protect America from the Reds that were coming to get us. On the very day he was assassinated, he had an emissary in Havana to reestablish normal relations, get rid of the embargo that has targeted the Cuban people, that continues to this day to target the Cuban people. What's that all about? What have the Cuban people ever done to the United States? What has the Cuban regime ever done to the United States? It's never attacked the United States. It's never assassinated anybody. It's never engaged in terrorism over here. Okay, so why does the U.S. continue to have this Cold War embargo? Well, because the Pentagon and the CIA want it that way. So Kennedy is upsetting the apple cart in a very big, fundamental way. He's got one more year in office after the peace speech at American University. Then it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to win re-election. It was clear that Barry Goldwater was going to be the Republican nominee. Kennedy would have smashed him the way Lyndon Johnson smashed him. That would have meant 4 more years of Kennedy. And then the likelihood is that his brother Bobby would have run for president at that point. And so there's 8 years. At this point in time, this vision is going to be taking hold. And Kennedy's certainly not going to let the Pentagon and the CIA get embroiled in the Middle East with foreign interventionism. So there'd be no terrorist blowback for those 5 more years of John Kennedy and possibly 8 more years of Bobby Kennedy. So what's the point of a national security state at that point? There would be no red threat, the red menace coming to get us. And here's the other thing, is that Kennedy is personally talking with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, on a personal basis, like a friendship basis. He's making friends with Khrushchev. Khrushchev's on the same page and says, I'm tired of this whole Cold War business too. Let's establish good relations. Now, this is still a time when the Soviets are controlling Eastern Europe. They're controlling East Germany. You've got a communist regime in Cuba, a communist regime in China, North Korea, North Vietnam. And Kennedy, nonetheless, is saying, we're going to have mutual, peaceful coexistence. We're going to have friendly relations. And he actually praises the Russians, talks about how they worked together with the United States in World War II. His speech was at American University was broadcast all across the Soviet Union. First time that had ever been done, or at least published, all across the Soviet Union. So that's why it's so important to understand, because that's the issue we have to deal with now. Is that, do we need to be driven by this anti-Russia animus? Is it possible to establish friendly, normal relations? Do we need a national security state anymore? Is a national security state in our interest? Is it consistent with a free society? And of course it's not. We've surrendered our liberties for this national security establishment, ostensibly to keep us safe from the Muslims, the terrorists, the illegal immigrants, the drug dealers, the Reds, the communists. Do we even need such a thing? Is it desirable, especially now that they're getting us closer and closer to the possibility of really annihilation of the human race with their machinations over there with Ukraine? It's not worth it. It's just not worth it. And we study the Kennedy administration to get a way out of this thing, to extricate ourselves from this deep foreign policy morass. Now, obviously, that means thinking at a higher level. We've all been indoctrinated into thinking, oh, strong national defense, Jacob, strong national defense. I mean, that's your standard conservative line, right? Strong national defense. Well, they're not talking about strong national defense. There is no possibility that any nation can attack and invade and conquer the United States. None. We've got two oceans on each side, and the ones over here, nobody's got the military capability, the money, the soldiers, the weaponry, the supply lines. We are totally safe from an invasion or occupation. And so what do we need the national security state for? We're not talking about strong national defense. You can have a basic military force like our founding system, a limited government republic that is able to mobilize people on a voluntary basis if somebody ever did try to invade us, which cannot happen in the near future. Nobody's got even the interest of doing it, much less the money, the soldiers, the weaponry, and so forth. So in order to establish freedom, not to mention financial well-being, look how much is being spent on the national security establishment. I mean, it's approaching $1 trillion now. I mean, how do you free yourself from an income tax when you've got this massive expenditure that's taking place? Now, there's one final thing that needs to be mentioned, and I'll promote my book again. I consider this a good book, and fortunately, I'm getting a lot of nice reviews there at Amazon. One of the biggest compliments I got was in one review that said, this is now one of my two favorite books, the other one being JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. Well, it's a huge compliment because that's my favorite book. I think it's the best book that's ever been written on the Kennedy assassination. I highly recommend it. JFK and the Unspeakable. And so to be put as in that category is quite made my day, that's for sure. Well, the thing to remember about the Cold War animus against Russia, the Soviet Union, the anti-communist crusade, and remember that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA were convinced that there was an international communist conspiracy. Now, you talk about conspiracy theorists. They were convinced that there was an international communist conspiracy that was based in Moscow to take over the world. Okay? Now, Kennedy's putting the kibosh to all this in his peace speech and his actions after his peace speech when he's over there making friends, making nice with Nikita Khrushchev. Well, there's something important to keep in mind, that the anti-Russia animus that was driving the Cold War was so extreme and so severe that the position of the Pentagon and the CIA was that if any foreign leader made friends with the Soviet Union, they were subject to assassination automatically. Okay, that's why they were trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. Castro hadn't done anything to the United States. Sure, he was a communist, but there's a lot of communists. There was a communist party here in the United States. It was when he reached out to the Soviets, to the Russians, saying, let's be friends, that marked him for assassination. Same thing had happened several years before in Guatemala with a man named Jacobo Arbenz. He was a democratically elected president of Guatemala. Okay, he was a socialist. He was taking land away from United Fruit Company, big, prominent, influential U.S. corporation operating in Guatemala. But that wasn't, and he was giving it to the poor. No, but that wasn't why they targeted him for a regime change, including assassination. Now, they won't still to this day, the CIA won't disclose its assassination list, but clearly Arbenz had to be at the top of the list. He was able to escape the country. Imagine a president having to escape a country in order to escape assassination and regime change. But Arbenz was marked the minute he said, I'm establishing friendships with the Russians and the Warsaw Pact people. I'm not interested in this Cold War. That's when they marked him for a regime change, including, undoubtedly, assassination. They assassinated Patrice Lumumba, the head of the Congo, for the same reason, that he was going to be leaning toward Russia. That you've got in Chile in 70 to 73, and remember, the CIA director, Richard Helms, lied to Congress, committed perjury, when they asked him about, well, did the CIA intervene here in Chile? And he says, no. And I think one of the reasons might be because he knew there were parallels there with what happened 10 years before with the Kennedy assassination. That the argument that the Pentagon and the CIA were making to their counterparts in the national security establishment in Chile. Chile was a national security state, okay, big, massive military intelligence establishment that, like very similar to the United States, was attached to these other three branches: the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And just like here, the judicial branch deferred to the national security branch, especially after the coup, when the military came to the forefront. Later on, the federal judiciary apologized to the Chilean people for deferring to them. And that's something that the federal judiciary has never done, at least not yet, here in the United States, when they deferred. But the argument was that the head of the Chilean national security establishment, a man named General Rene Schneider, he was the overall commander of the military intelligence forces. He said, no, the Constitution of our country doesn't provide for a coup to remove a democratically elected president. And the position of the Pentagon and the CIA was that you have a duty. You have a moral duty. We don't care what your Constitution, you shouldn't care what your Constitution says. Your president poses a threat to your national security. He is making friends with the Russians. He's making friends with the Cubans. And that alone is a threat to your national security. And so they got rid of Schneider. The CIA orchestrated a kidnapping that turned into an assassination. And he got killed for just standing up for his Constitution. And then they mobilized Pinochet and these other people that says, yes, the national security establishment has the duty, regardless of what the Constitution says, of violently removing a president from office. And so they embarked on this war against it was a war between the national security branch and the executive branch. And it was the same kind of war between the national security branch over here and the Kennedy administration. It was a war under the radar screen, but clearly the war was going on over the future direction of America. And as I detail in my book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story, that war came to an end. Because if a foreign president poses a threat to national security that's making friends with Russia, imagine what greater threat than a domestic president that is doing the same thing. There's no way around it. I mean, a domestic president, obviously, if making friends with Russia, if ending the anti-Russia animus, it justifies assassinating foreign presidents, then how about a president who's operating from within the federal government? I mean, we saw when they thought that Trump had become an agent of the Russians. I mean, we saw that huge anti-Russia animus. We got to impeach him. We have to remove him. We have to get this investigation going. Well, that was the mindset when Kennedy started making nice with Nikita Khrushchev and started making friends and sent an emissary to Cuba. That here is a person that's operating from within. And I go into this in much more detail in this new book of mine, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. So that's my Libertarian Angle for this week. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of FFF. Again, if you're new, subscribe to our FFF Daily and to our monthly journal. I look